All right, well, so we're going to get started. Before we get started, one of the things that I asked everybody to do when they come in the door here is that they leave their average outside. Because we only have greatness in here. We recognize the great principle, we recognize the greatness in each other, and we accept that as being so. So as we come together this morning, we realize that there is a power to presence for good in the universe that's available to each and every one of us. As we open our hearts, our minds, our consciousness to understanding the truth of who we are, we realize that we are God expressed as individual beings, that God expresses for us by expressing through us, and in so doing, that we have a connectedness with our source beyond what most people even begin to understand, that we can go to source, we can open our hearts and our minds to it, and we can speak our word and believe and know at the level of our belief that we will see principle expressed and demonstrating in our life. So today we come together, we celebrate, we share with like-mindedness, we learn a little bit, we take what we learn, we put it into our life practice for this next week, and we experience life and livingness at an ever higher and greater and better and more abundant, loving, and beautiful way. And so it is.
And so it is.
All right. So, last week I talked about some of our spiritual tools. Today I want to talk about our relationship with Source, our relationship with the universe, if you will. And I'm going to share a couple things that, actually I'm going to get a drink, but I'm going to share a couple things. Going back and looking at the Old Testament from a metaphysical understanding, looking at the stories in there and not taking them as literal stories, but seeing a story that's deeper than the story that's shared. Last week I talked about this prophet Jeremiah, who was followed by another prophet Ezekiel, and they were the first two to really, in the story of the Hebrews, they were the first two to really lay an importance on the individual rather than the group, rather than the tribe. Seeing that God was a God of individuals, not as a tribal God of war for the tribe. And so I'm going to kind of pick that up there, and then we're gonna get into this a little bit more. So, anyway, this is Jeremiah. Right now, the Hebrews they're in a really bad state. They've been overrun. They've been spread out through Egypt and Babylon, and a generation or two has passed, and everybody's blaming their ancestors for the condition they're in. In other words, instead of taking personal responsibility, they're pointing their finger outside themselves. Jeremiah comes along and he says, hate to break it to you folks, but this isn't the way it's got to be. He was compelled to fall back on God in secret and to find an inner temple when the outer temple was destroyed. That he did this is evidenced in many passages that reveal his intimate inward struggle with God and with reliance upon God. O Yahweh, thou knowest and remember me and visit me. Thy words were found and I did eat them, and thy words were unto me a joy and the rejoicing of my heart. O Yahweh, my strength and my stronghold and my refuge in the day of affliction. Going within is where we find our connectedness with Source, with God, with however you want to refer to God as, right? Taking personal responsibility for our life experience. That's difficult for a lot of people to do because, there's so much chaos going on outside. There's so many stresses, so many, things that come at us from so many different ways, and it's very easy to say it's not my fault. It's very easy to sit in that position of being a victim. And that's what part of this story was about. But we're not victims. God did not create us to be victims. God created us to live, and to live abundantly to the highest and greatest degree of livingness that we can encompass in our life and in potential. God provided for us everything we could need, want, and desire in order to do that. But our journey, our struggle, if you will, is to learn the truth, to step out of ignorance, to begin to see that as we learn the truth of who we are, and the truth of who we are is that we are divine spiritual beings. We are part of an expression of the divine principle that we're not separate from, that there is no separateness. When we learn that truth, the greater the degree that we learn that truth, in truth, we also learn at a greater degree about the divine principle, about God. As we discover ourselves, what we're really doing is we are discovering God. Because this is the only place where we can experience and know God. It's one thing to get it intellectually, we get it in our head, but that's not a knowingness in the sense of an experiential understanding. But when we get to the level that we begin to move in that direction and begin to get a clue, as Holmes said, and I've shared with you before, that having a spiritual experience, if you will, is something that everybody needs to have in their life. Now, you may be able to create that, experience it more than once, and most of us have experienced things in our life where we realize that there's more to the experience than just what we accepted. Whether you're out in nature, whether you're in a situation where maybe you're a little terrified because things are going south on you, so to speak, and all of a sudden there's that calming moment. You realize in that moment, it may be quick, but you realize there's something more to what's going on than just the physical experience. Okay? Maybe it comes to you in your treatment, in your prayer work, or your meditation. However it comes to you, it'll come to each and every one of us, because that's part of our journey. And as our journey is the discovery of the truth of who and what we are, like I say, God provides for us everything that we need along the way. What we have to provide is choice, is a desire to grow, to learn, okay, a commitment to doing that. And it's a pretty strong commitment. If we don't commit to it, if we make it kind of a random thing, then what's going to happen is our experience is going to be very random. We talk about when we treat, that New Thought, religious science in particular, was a healing principle, a healing practice before it became a religion of sorts. Because that's what we did as practitioners. We treated people. We saw demonstrations, whether it be in health, whether it be in relationship, abundance, whatever. More peace in someone's life. We've kind of gotten away from that in more recent years as we have focused on being ministers and having churches instead of teaching and demonstrating and doing what it is that we originally did. So, part of this, recognizing our relationship to God as individuals, knowing that if God is available to us at the level of our belief, because that's what we were told, that's what is taught by the master teacher, then we can grow our belief. You're not going to be told that it's done unto you at the level of your belief, and then someone kind of kneecap you and you can't grow your belief. And some people believe that. No pun intended. They believe that what they believe now, that's it, that's the limit. Beliefs can grow, faith can grow. But we need to also have experience, because we've got to go beyond intellectualism. We've got to embody it. So moving on here. Again, this is from Jeremiah, and about him. He says, "In the end, Yahweh was no longer a tribal God in the old sense of caring solely for the social group. He was a personal God as well, and in the sense of caring for and bringing interior sustenance to individuals, one by one. Out of this new dimension in Israel's experience came such hymns as this post-exilic temple, the 139th Psalm, if you're interested. And I'm going to read this to you out of here. If I can catch the language on this, right? It says, "O Yahweh, thou hast searched me and knows me. Thou hast my downsitting and my uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. Thou searchest out my path and my laying down. And thou art acquainted with all of my ways. For there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Yahweh, thou knowest it altogether. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thy hand upon me." God will provide for us. This comes out of the Old Testament, which is not real prominent in New Thought teachings, because everybody's kind of generally focused on on what Jesus taught. And what he taught is very powerful, but there is a backstory. And the reason why I want to talk about this in the beginning today is because we oftentimes think the Old Testament doesn't really apply. But you go back and you look at this and you see how in truth it does apply, and knowing in time, and I'm talking about in real time when these things were written down some 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, no, actually several thousand years ago, that there was in the spiritual understanding of the day, in that day, things that we talk about, we teach about, and we put into practice in our life today. But it wasn't until that time between the Old Testament and the New Testament where a lot of this really shifted. And when Jesus came and he began teaching, and one of the things he did was run afoul of the priesthood, because what he taught was what is often referred to as in the prophetic line. They weren't exactly the same. And ultimately he ran afoul of the priesthood. And so next Sunday is Easter Sunday, and today's Palm Sunday. So this is kind of my introduction to that here and now. Okay? The Old Testament, there's a lot of richness there that when you take the time to look at it, that underpins things in New Thought that we teach today, that set the stage for this teacher when he came into the world. And I often refer to him as a radical rabbi, and he was, because what he taught was so different from the God, so different from the teachings that the Hebrews, the Israelites, had come to expect, had come to believe, and made part of their experience. That, they listened to him and they went, wow, who is this guy? What's he teaching? What's this about? And you add on to that the things that he did. And you can choose to believe that maybe that's just a little bit of propaganda that was put in the story that didn't really happen. My personal belief is that it did happen. And the reason why I do believe that it happened is because, when you play like that game called telephone, you got a string of people, and what starts at the beginning, and it gets so different at the end. Well, Jesus died. And the first books weren't written until about 15 years after his passing, and that started with the epistles from Paul. The first gospel was written somewhere about 35 years after the death of Jesus. So there was an oral tradition that went on for a long time. Did things get changed? Probably. But the thing about this telephone game is, it's a very interesting thing. If you start with something that's very outlandish at the beginning, everything else gets changed, but that outlandishness, that really bizarre whatever it is, ends up at the end. Now the story around it can get really crazy. But the thing is, what was the most outlandish thing about Jesus? Well, his teachings for one, but the so-called miracles that he did. And he did them. Maybe not exactly the way it's in the book, but he had to have done them because the stories are there. And they would have been filtered out. There was a lot of stuff that took place in the first 100 years after the death of Jesus. There's a lot of material that is not in the Bible that was written at that time. Some of it got destroyed, some of it's still there. There are snippets and tidbits that they have. But the consistency through this is the miracles. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, they're all the same, and I've talked about it. I'm not going to go into it today. And then John is radically different in a way. But still, there's the miracles. And they're there. Now, if you say, well, that's fine, but that was only him, right? Wrong. Even in the Bible, the book of Acts tells us about the apostles going out. Even when Jesus was alive, he talks about or sending out his disciples to do what? To do miracles. If he can send his disciples out to do miracles, he doesn't have to be with them, and they can do it. Maybe other people can do them, right? So he gets hung on the cross. And his apostles go out, and for a couple of 100 years, they're still doing these things according to the historical record. But the church later on said, well, no, let's roll that back. It's only Jesus that did the miracles. And maybe, there's some stuff in the New Testament, but we don't give a lot of credence to that. We lay everything on Jesus. Okay? Our relationship with the divine is the same potential relationship that this man called Jesus had and his followers. What he did, we can do, I believe, and more. You're right, as he said. But, society, history has told us for so many years, you can't do that. And every time someone pops up that does that, they go, well, there's, things like quack or whatever, fraud, gets bandied about. But history is too full of individuals that have done that. Okay? Until you get to the beginning of the 20th century, when New Thought is beginning to take off. We had Quimby that started in the mid-19th century. People saw what he was doing. You have to understand, at the time that Quimby was doing this, you had a better chance of surviving if you didn't go to the doctor than you do if you did. And yet people went to him and cures were recorded. So much so that one of his students, a person that he healed, Mary Baker Eddy, went off and she created what later became Christian Science. Yes. And they have a belief in healing. Yes. Okay? Now the thing is, in the early part of the 20th century, the Fillmores, Holmeses, Joel Goldsmith, Emmett Foxes, and we can go on and on and on and name all these individuals. A lot of these individuals wrote books, or books were written about them, and one of the prominent things in what's written about them is the healings that they did. And you have to assume something. Either the books are frauds and lies, or these individuals did what they claim to have done. Right. It can't be both. Yeah. Well, there's too many books, too many individuals, and too much time. And if they were frauds, they would have been found out. If they were lies, they would have been exposed. Okay? So the only other option is they did these things. Well, there's nothing that separates those individuals from the people that are sitting in here right now other than the level of their understanding and beliefs and their willingness to accept it and to put it into practice in their lives or help put it into practice in the lives of others. Okay, out of the science of mind, or in the science of mind, however you want to phrase that. Okay, talking about man's relationship. This, of course, does not mean that man is God. What he's saying is that we are created in the image and likeness of God, and God is expressing as us individually. But this, of course, does not mean that man is God. It means that in his small way and small world of individual expression, his nature is identical with God. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's identical with God. Well, what's God's nature? God's nature is to make a lot of mistakes, right? No, God doesn't make mistakes. God's nature is to create a lot of evil in the world, right? Yeah. No, God doesn't create evil in the world either. What God does is God creates. Yeah. God creates, and God has created. And God has allowed its creation to grow and evolve through a few years anyway, until at some point, some individual stuck their head up one day and said, "Oh, I am. I can think. I'm different. I'm not you. You are something different than me." And we began to have individualized self-understanding. And it took years for that to move to where the individual became important. And that's part of the lesson that we learn out of the journey of the Hebrews. It's not a journey that is restricted just to them. It took place worldwide in different ways. The tribal culture was the culture of the world. And then at some point the individual became more important than the tribe. Although the individual supported the tribe, and the benefits of the tribe were determined by the individuals acting in an ethical and moral way, if you will, as their relationship to God unfolds. It's an interesting thought. Jeremiah and Ezekiel talk about this, that the problems that the Hebrews were having was because the individuals in the tribe weren't acting in morally and ethical ways that would be in alignment with principle, alignment with God. And therefore, the tribe, the group, suffered. Now, my personal belief is we look out in the world today and we see, all the chaos that's going on out there. As I shared with you last week, I read a headline that was recently in some periodical that a survey was done, and the survey found that, and they take these surveys on a regular, ongoing basis, but the survey found that the religion of atheism far exceeded all religious organizations within our country. And again, like I said last week, it's not that I'm concerned that, we have unbelievers out there in the sense that everybody as an individual can believe what they want. But my understanding is that if you believe that there is nothing, you don't believe in a God of any way, shape, or form, then your life starts at the day you were birthed, and it ends the day that you stop breathing. And once it's done, it's over. There's nothing after that. People that have a spiritual understanding, whatever it is, believe in some sort of creator or creators, a consciousness, a beingness, whether it be anthropomorphic, doesn't make any difference. But they seek to have a spiritual connection with that which they believe to be their creator. And in the process, in the journey of seeking to have that spiritual connection, things happen within our own beingness, our own understanding. And the thing is, again, it's not something that it's going to work if we get it intellectually. You can read a book and get information, but that information isn't going to demonstrate in your life if you don't embody that information. When you start your spiritual journey, when you start down this path of self-discovery, the truth of who you are, it requires that you have to put into practice the things that you've been learning so that you can experience. When you learn about affirmative treatment, if you just let other people speak their words and you're not a part of it, you'll never be a part of it in the sense that you'll never even be able to experience it demonstrating and working and manifesting in your life. It's only when you begin to participate. Now, that participation may be by going to a practitioner, for example, or it may be beginning to seek out, doing it for yourself. If you seek out to do it for yourself, what do you got to do? You got to practice. Because prayer, affirmative prayer, is a skill. A lot of ministers don't talk about affirmative prayer treatment as a skill, but it's a skill just as a skill that Ted displays playing the guitar. If you don't practice it, your skill is dull. If you don't practice it, your skill is minimal, or maybe not even at all. But as you practice it, as you practice it and you see demonstrations begin to take place in your life, and you take those demonstrations as feedback, like when Ted plays a song and people clap because he's getting pretty good now. I've been working with him. It's 3 weeks and he's doing good, right? No, but a lot of practice went into the work that he does here. And the same in our affirmative treatment. Same in meditation. It's important that we stop every day and take time and just clear our minds. Let that chaos go and ground ourselves. Be in the moment. Be present. And then if you can add to that a little affirmative treatment. If you're new and that's where you start. If you've been a while, maybe it's more than a little bit. If you start your day claiming you're good in the day before you open your eyes, that's important. If you end your day in gratitude and thanksgiving before you go to sleep, that's important. If these things aren't important to you yet, well, you'll get there. As you walk your path, as you move in the direction of a greater relationship with this that we call divine principle. Because our relationship with principle ultimately is our expression of livingness in this life. Torah tells us that our purpose for being here is to live life at a higher degree of livingness. Okay? And a higher degree of livingness for each of us is a little bit different. We don't all define it the same way. Some people, it might be, exploring the world. Some people, it might be climbing mountains. For some people, it might be writing books or music or teaching or whatever. Because within the core of each and every one of us, that seed was planted in us from the divine, from God, from principle, and that seed is the seed of greatness, of genius. Part of our journey to learn the truth of who we are is that self-discovery. And there's no time in our life that it's ever too late to start that journey. Whether we're this big or whether you're almost as old as I am. Doesn't make any difference. You can do it. And in doing it, you can begin to peel back the layers of the lotus, of the onion, however you want to look at it. You know, if you want to see life is sweet, it's a lotus. If life's a little bitter, it's an onion. But get rid of the onion ultimately and get to the lotus, because life is sweet. Life does come at us at the speed of life, for sure. But we have a bigger God. We're never alone. These are things that you can't say if you don't believe them. Well, you can say them, but if you don't believe them, it's not going to do you any good. But if you know that you have a relationship with the universal as it expresses in your life by expressing through your life, then when you make that statement, regardless of what life is presenting you with, you know, that's a side point. Okay, yeah, I got a lot to do, got a lot to overcome, but me and my partner here, you know, that's the Long Ranger. I'm the partner, really. That's where the power is. I'm the tag-along, you know. And I'm the tag-along, but the power is available to me because it expresses through me. At the core of my being is the infiniteness, is divine principle. In that, if you understand that with God all things are possible, and God is infinite in itself, that means what is at the core of my being is infinite. I may look at it as limited because I see, you know, this is it, right? Until I know different. And I know different through walking my path, through seeking, through the doing this. That's why when I talked about tools last week, the tools are here within ourselves. And they're great tools. They're beautiful tools. They're divine tools. But if we don't open the toolbox, they'll sit there. The good thing is they don't rust. But they just sit there until we go to them. Okay? So, man is made out of and from life. As effect must partake of the nature of its cause, so man must partake the nature of the divine from which he springs. We are. Okay? And we have to know that we are. If our thought is creative, and if we have selectivity, that is, volition and choice, and if we are unfolding to a discovery of our true nature, which must already be perfect, then the obligation and responsibility of this nature could impose freedom or bondage upon us. Temporarily, but our bondage cannot be real from the standpoint of the absolute. But it's real if you're going through it. It's real if you experience it. And for people that are in that space in their life, and when we talk to them, if there's someone that's never had any understanding, no relationship with new thought, and their life is, we'll say, is in bondage. Okay, you can define that however you want. And you say, you don't have to live that way. You don't have to experience it. They look at you and they go, well, you're nuts. You know, how can you say these things? Well, we can. And the reason why we can is because those that have gone before us have demonstrated and manifested. They've written about it. They've shared experiences. Practitioners today that are doing it have those experiences to share and know. You know, it's like I talked about Don Ringnes years ago when he had that phone call from that woman. She wasn't a New Thought religious science person. She'd never heard of it until, you know, shortly before she called Don. She called Don and she said, I hear you do this prayer stuff. And he said, well, we do affirmative treatment. And she said, well, you know, could you do this for me because the doctors have given me 6 months to live. And in a couple of weeks I'm going to have a surgery, not to prolong my life, but just to make what I've got left more comfortable. Because I'm going to die. And so he treated for her. When he was done, they hung up. He never spoke to her again. Never saw her, ever. Never met her in person. 10 weeks later, he got a check from her for $10,000. Because when she went back to the doctors, they couldn't find anything. Now, they chalk it up to misdiagnosis. But there was a lot that went into that original diagnosis, you know, to know that it wasn't a misdiagnosis. And these are the truths that we know. When we take those truths and we put them into practice in our life. Can I share your story, Marion? Shortly after I met Marion, she was involved in a very bad accident. The next time I saw her, after the first time I met her, she was in a coma at community hospital, and things weren't looking good. And her mom and dad asked me to come and treat, and I did. And I guess it worked because she's here. No, her comeback, her recovery is beyond the pale. but it's not beyond truth. And that's the deal. And that's why she sits here. Because she knows if she doesn't show up, I'm going to pray again, and she's not going to like what I have. No. But, there are truths, when known, they will demonstrate. Okay? It's up for us to discover those and to put them into practice. From Keep a True Lent, written by Fillmore, Palm Sunday, I'm not going to read all this to you, just a couple of things. He says, in man, Jerusalem, and Jerusalem here is used metaphorically, okay? He says, is the abiding consciousness of spiritual peace, which is the result of continuous realization of spiritual power tempered with spiritual poise and confidence. Mm-hmm. It's a process. We're not going to get it in a day, okay? It's a journey. And he says, Jesus symbolizes our I am destiny. His going up to Jerusalem means our taking the last step in unfoldment in the preparatory to the final step when the personality is entirely crucified and the Christ triumphs, which we'll talk about next week. Some ministers don't get into the resurrection, the crucifixion of Jesus. I think we've got a great metaphor, truth that we can teach from that. Jesus did his job in his teaching, and I believe that he paid the price for his teaching. He went up against the priestly class. They took him, they put him on trial before the Sanhedrin, and what was going on historically at that time in Jerusalem, it was Passover. The Romans get very tense at Passover. They bring in more guards to the city, and when the Sanhedrin brought Jesus before Pilate, he said, I'll give you whatever you want, just don't cause any more trouble. And that's my paraphrasing, but that's kind of the way it played out. I've been asked, well, okay, if that's the case, why didn't Jesus speak up in his defense? And I believe that it's because he so believed in the word that he taught. He so believed in the truth that he brought to the world that he basically stood up for it and said, this is it. And I'm not going to change. I'm not going to back down. And he didn't. And that was his gift ultimately to the world behind his teaching. So, talking about our relationship, the body, our physical body, the body of God. Okay. It's the outward form, Holmes says. He says it's the entire manifestation of spirit, both visible and invisible. That is the body of God. Within this one body of God is included all lesser bodies. This one body, coupled with the intelligence running through it, is called the Son, or the second person in the Trinity. This of course includes man, both visible and invisible. It also includes every gradation of consciousness, from the simple to the complex, from a cell to an archangel. It is the entire manifestation of spirit on any and all planes. Body is the definite outline of flesh containing all the ideas which go to make the complete physical instrument that is us in our life. But if you recall last week when I said when we teach that there's one life, that life is God. We're not talking about just the breathing, respirating plants and animals. We're talking about the entire creation. The Eastern philosophies had a saying that went something like, God sleeps in the rocks, dreams in the plants, stirs in the animals, and awakens in man. Trord tells us that God, through the evolutionary process, brought its creation to the point to where there was consciousness that could recognize itself, and thus as God expressed through it, that there was something to come back. That's why our purpose is to live this life, to live it as abundantly as possible with as much livingness as possible, however we define that for ourselves, because that's our journey. That's our purpose. Okay? Did you get that? You understand that? We're good? No questions? That's it for today, and so it is. Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah.